Hey son, before we begin, take a breath. Set whatever you are carrying down for a moment, because what you are about to hear is not just history, it is a memory. It is the sound of men who were told the door was closed, and who built their own door, framed it, hung it, and walked through it every single morning before the sun came up. If this kind of storytelling means something to you, go ahead and hit that like button. Subscribe if you want more of it. And leave a comment below telling me where in the world you are watching from tonight. I read every single one. Now, before we step into the 1930s together, let me ask you something. Have you ever wondered what a Monday morning actually felt like in 1932? Not the history book version, not the statistics, the real thing. The air before sunrise in a neighborhood where everybody knew everybody. The smell of wood smoke and coffee coming from 3 houses at once. The sound of a man lacing up his work boots in the dark while his family still slept. What did it feel like to earn something with your hands in a country that had not yet decided to fully see you? What did a man say to his son when the banks had failed and the jobs had dried up and the world outside the door was cold? In every way a world can be cold. What did he do instead of nothing? What did Saturday morning sound like on a street where half the men were running something on the side? Something quiet, something theirs. And what did it feel like to be a child watching your father move through the world like that, steady and resourceful and proud, in a way that had nothing to do with anyone else's permission? Those are the questions we are sitting with tonight. And just like that, it is 1933. The Great Depression is not a chapter in a textbook. It is the actual weather. The coffee is on. Your father is already dressed. He did not wait for an invitation. He made one. And the day, as it always did, is just beginning. It is early morning, still dark, and your father is already moving. The ice trade in the 1930s was one of the most reliable hustles a black man in a southern or northern city could run. Because everybody needed it, nobody cared who brought it, and the work respected no color line. He would buy a block from the ice house before dawn, load it into a wooden cart wrapped in burlap to slow the melt, and work the neighborhood street by street before the heat of the day arrived. The ice house smelled like cold iron and sawdust. That is the first thing you noticed when you went with him as a boy. The way the cold hit you in the face before you even got through the door. The way your breath suddenly became something you could see. The men inside moved with the particular efficiency of people who had done the same motion 10,000 times. Block after block, lifted with iron tongs, stacked and wrapped, loaded and gone. Your father knew all of them. He knew their names, and they knew his, and that familiarity was part of what made the morning run. The cart was wooden, 2 wheels, a flat bed, and a handle your father had wrapped in cloth to keep the splinters from his palms. He had built the wrapping himself, wound it tight and neat. You noticed things like that about him. He took care of his tools, because his tools were how he took care of you. The neighborhood woke up slowly. By the time your father turned onto the first residential block, windows were beginning to show light. The sound of the cartwheels on the street, that particular rolling knock of wood and iron on uneven pavement, was a sound people recognized. Housewives came to their front doors in housecoats. Older men leaned out from porches. Children appeared from nowhere, the way children do, barefoot on the front steps watching him work. The icebox in the 1930s was not a refrigerator. It was exactly what the name said it was. A wooden cabinet lined with tin or zinc, insulated, with cork or sawdust between the walls. with a compartment at the top where the ice block sat and kept everything below it cold. It dripped constantly into a pan underneath that needed emptying every day. The ice itself lasted 2 to 3 days, depending on the heat, which meant your father had customers who needed him every 2 or 3 days, without fail. That was the beauty of it as a business. The demand was built into physics. He charged by the block or by the pound, depending on what the customer needed. Some families wanted a full block. Others could only afford a smaller piece, enough to get them through the next day. He never made a person feel small for asking for less. He cut it, wrapped it in paper, carried it through the side door the way the iceman always came, in the back or the side, not the front, and set it in the box without being told where it went. He already knew. He had been coming to most of these houses long enough to know where everything was. In the deep summer months, the work was relentless. The heat melted his product faster, which meant more trips to the ice house, more loads, longer days. But it also meant people needed him more urgently. You could hear the relief in a woman's voice when she opened the door and saw him standing there with a block and the tongs. That sound stayed with you. By the time he came home in the early afternoon, his shirt was soaked through, and his hands were red from the cold and the work. He would sit at the kitchen table, and your mother would put a plate in front of him without a word needing to pass between them. He had done what he set out to do. The day had been met. That was enough. There is something worth sitting with in that image. A man who went out before the sun, who worked the cold and the heat both in the same morning, who knew every back door in a 6-block radius and was trusted at all of them. He did not wait for a corporation to give him a route. He made the route. He was the route. And every family on those blocks ate cooler food and kept their milk a day longer because he showed up. In the 1930s, if you lived in a black neighborhood in Chicago, Harlem, Detroit, or Baltimore, you knew what the numbers were. You did not have to explain it to anyone on the block. The informal lottery had been running for decades, woven so tightly into the fabric of daily neighborhood life that it barely registered as illegal to the people who depended on it. Your father was not a criminal in anyone's mind who mattered to him. He was a man who moved through the neighborhood every day, collected slips and coins, and came back in the evening with an envelope. The way the numbers worked was elegant in its simplicity. A player would pick a 3-digit number, place a bet as small as a penny, and wait for the winning combination to be drawn, usually pulled from a publicly verifiable source like the last 3 digits of a stock exchange figure or a racetrack payout, so that nobody could accuse the banker of fixing the result. The odds were long. But a penny bet on the right number could pay out $6, and $6 in 1933 was a week of groceries. Your father moved in the morning. That was the collection window before noon, before the number dropped in the afternoon. He had a territory, a specific set of blocks that belonged to him in the understanding of the operation, and he worked them on foot. He knew the barber who always played the same number every day without exception. He knew the woman on the 3rd floor of the building on Maplewood who changed her number every morning based on a dream she had the night before. He kept all of it in his head or in a small notebook with a soft cover that he kept in his breast pocket. The slips were small, folded pieces of paper, sometimes no bigger than a thumbnail when folded properly. He collected them and the coins together, rubber-banded the money, tucked the slips, and moved on to the next stop. He did not linger. The work required a particular kind of social grace, the ability to conduct business in plain sight without conducting it in plain sight. A conversation on a stoop that lasted 45 seconds was a transaction. A handshake outside a barber shop was a receipt. The numbers operation in most black neighborhoods of the 1930s was not a foreign imposition. It had grown up from within. The bankers were community members. The runners were neighbors. The money, for the most part, stayed on the block. When someone hit, the word spread fast. And it spread like good news because it was. People celebrated a neighbor's number coming in the way you would celebrate anything fortunate happening to someone you knew. Your father understood the risk. He was not naive about it. The police in most cities enforced the numbers laws selectively, which is to say they enforced them when it was useful to someone and looked away when it was not. A runner got picked up sometimes. Usually it cost a fine that the banker would cover. Your father kept his head down, kept his route clean, kept his mouth shut about the details of the operation with anyone who had not earned the right to those details. What he brought home was modest but steady. And steady in the 1930s was everything. Steady meant the rent was covered. Steady meant there was something in the icebox. Steady meant your father came home in the evening with the particular calm of a man who had met the day on his own terms and had not been turned away from it. He sat in his chair, read the paper, and did not explain himself to anyone. The numbers were not glamorous. They were not the stuff of movies, not in the way your father ran them. They were quiet work, relational work, the work of a man who knew his community deeply enough to move through it every single day and be trusted by it. That trust was the real asset. The coins were just what the trust produced. There is a difference between a man who shines shoes when someone sits down in front of him and a man who has a route. Your father had a route. He knew which barber on 5th Street needed his kit, serviced by 8 in the morning. He knew which hotel lobby would have 3 businessmen waiting by 7:45. He knew the rhythm of the blocks he worked as well as he knew the rhythm of his own breathing. The kit itself was a piece of craftsmanship. A wooden box, sometimes homemade, sometimes purchased from a supply house, with a footrest on top and compartments inside for the polished tins, the daubers, the horsehair brushes, the buffing cloths arranged by color so that black and brown and ox blood never got mixed. Your father kept his kit the way a surgeon keeps instruments, clean, organized, immediately ready. There was no fumbling when a customer sat down. Everything went where it needed to go in a motion that was almost musical. Polish in the 1930s came in tins with tight lids and smelled like mineral spirits and wax, a sharp, clean smell that you associated entirely with your father's hands. He would work the polish into the leather in small circles, firm and deliberate. And then the brush would come up and the rhythm would change. Faster now, the brush moving in a blur across the toe of the shoe, while the customer read a newspaper or looked out the window or said nothing at all. Most of his customers were men who wore leather shoes to work every day and understood that a well-kept shoe said something about a man before he opened his mouth. That belief was near universal in professional circles in the 1930s. You were what your shoes said you were. Your father knew this, and he knew his customers knew it, and there was a mutual respect in the transaction that went beyond the 10 or 15 cents that changed hands at the end. The hotel lobby was his most reliable stop. He had an arrangement with the doorman, a man named Curtis, who had worked the lobby for 11 years and who sent customers in your father's direction in exchange for a small weekly consideration. This was how the informal economy worked, not exploitation. Mutual benefit clearly understood and honored by both parties. Curtis sent men to the chair. Your father kept the chair busy. Everybody ate. The barbershop stops were different. In a barbershop, everybody waited. and waiting men with nothing to do would look down at their shoes and remember they needed a shine. Your father would set up near the door, not in the way, but visible, and he would work quietly while the barbers worked loudly, and the whole room talked at once the way barbershop rooms always did. Every conversation running into every other conversation, the radio going, somebody laughing about something that happened on Tuesday. He expanded the route slowly and deliberately. A new stop only added when he was certain he could service it consistently. Consistency was the whole business. A customer who could count on seeing your father in the lobby every weekday morning at 7:45 was a customer who stopped carrying his own polished tin. He outsourced that part of his morning to your father, and that dependency, small and mundane as it was income that renewed itself without being asked. By midday, he had worked through the route, and the afternoon was for walk-ins wherever he set up his box, on a corner or outside a courthouse, or near a transit stop where men in good shoes moved in and out in numbers. He read the city the way a fisherman reads water. He knew where the traffic was, and he put himself in it. What your father built was not just a job. It was a small economy with him at the center of it. And he built it with nothing but skill, consistency, and the knowledge that a man whose shoes look right walks into every room a little taller. If your father owned a truck or a mule and a wagon in the 1930s, he owned something that most men did not, which was leverage. Hauling was everywhere. Furniture moving, coal delivery, junk collection, debris removal after a construction job, moving a family from one side of town to the other on a Saturday for $2 and a hot meal. The hauling hustle did not require a storefront or a license in most places. The truck, if he had one, was likely a Model T or a Model A Ford, bought used and kept running through a combination of mechanical self-education and sheer stubbornness. He knew every sound the truck made and what each sound meant. A particular rattle on the left side meant one thing. A hesitation on a cold start meant another. He fixed what he could himself and traded labor with the mechanic 2 streets over for the things he could not. The mule, if that was what he had instead, was its own kind of partner. A working animal in the 1930s was not a romantic notion. It was a daily relationship that required attention, feed, veterinary knowledge, and patience. The mule had a name. You knew the name. You had probably fed it carrots from your hand on Saturday afternoons, when your father let you come along on the shorter runs. The moving jobs were the most physically demanding. Furniture in the 1930s was built heavy, solid wood, no particle board, no hollow cores. A wardrobe was 2 men's work at minimum. A piano was a negotiation between 4 men, a staircase, and the laws of physics. Your father had done enough of it that he had developed a system for every kind of piece, a specific grip, a specific angle, a specific way of communicating with the other men on the job, through short calls and body language so that nobody got caught under something they could not handle. He charged by the load or by the hour depending on the job. Moving a family across town was a flat rate agreed upon before anything was touched. Junk hauling was by the load. Coal delivery was by the ton or the half-ton. He kept the prices fair, and he kept them consistent, which meant people recommended him without being asked. The referral network in a black neighborhood in the 1930s was the only advertising that mattered. The debris work came in waves tied to construction and demolition cycles in the city. When a block got torn down for a new building or a road project, there was material to be removed, and someone had to remove it. Your father bid on those jobs when he could get in front of the right person. And sometimes he could and sometimes he could not. But when he got one, it was a week of steady work at better than average pay. Saturday was the big moving day. Families relocated on Saturdays because it was the one day when more hands were available, when neighbors could help carry boxes and children could be underfoot without anyone missing work or school. Your father would have his Saturday booked sometimes a week ahead. He would finish one job by noon, eat whatever someone's wife pressed on him at the door, and be at the next address by 1. He came home on Saturday evenings with aching arms and a quiet satisfaction that was different from any other kind. The work had been visible. He had moved something from one place to another, and both places were now different because of it. He had helped a family begin something new in a new home. He had cleared ground for something to be built. The labor had shape and consequence, and he felt both of them in his back and his hands, and he did not complain about either one. Some men had a chair at a shop. Others had a chair in the kitchen. Your father might have been the second kind, the man who did not pay rent on a booth, but who had a steady book of heads that came to the house on Thursday evenings and Saturday afternoons. A kitchen barber in the 1930s was a quiet institution. The setup was always the same in its essentials. A chair pulled to the center of the kitchen floor, away from the table, with enough room to walk around it on all sides. A towel over the back. A hand, mirror on the counter. The clippers, if he had electric ones, plugged into the ceiling fixture with an adapter, the cord draping down in a gentle arc. The scissors in a glass of blue barbicide on the windowsill. The straight razor laid out on a folded cloth beside the sink. The smell of the kitchen on a cutting night was particular and specific. Bay rum and talcum powder, and the faint metallic smell of the clippers running, and underneath all of it, the lingering smell of whatever had been cooked for dinner, so that the whole room was layered with domesticity and craft at the same time. If you close your eyes now and try to remember it, that combination of smells might be the first thing that comes back. His customers came through the back door. That was understood without being stated. The front door was for formal occasions. The back door was for the men of the neighborhood coming in for a cut and a conversation in the kind of easy company that only existed in a space where nobody was performing anything for anybody else. They would sit at the kitchen table and wait their turn, talking to your father while he worked, talking to each other, sometimes talking to you if you were doing homework at the far end of the table and tried to look invisible. Your father had learned to cut from watching, then from practicing on brothers and cousins, then from years of doing it until his hands knew what his eyes were still figuring out. He could not have explained the technique in formal terms. He could demonstrate it. His hands moved with a confidence that was indistinguishable from artistry, the comb lifting the hair at just the right angle, the scissors following in a motion so practiced it looked effortless. He charged less than the shop. That was the whole proposition. A shop cut in the 1930s might cost 25 cents. Your father charged 15, sometimes a dime, for someone he knew was short that week, with the understanding that they would make it right next time, and that next time was not a threat or a countdown. It was simply the continuation of a relationship. Most of them did make it right. The conversation that happened in that kitchen was not small talk. Or rather, it was small talk in the sense that it concerned the ordinary stuff of ordinary life, the job situation, the landlord, the children, the church business, who had moved in on the corner, what had happened at the plant. But ordinary life in the 1930s for black men in American cities was not actually ordinary. It was navigated daily with a precision and an awareness that required constant processing. The kitchen was where that processing happened, out loud, among men who understood the terrain, because they were all walking it together. By 9 o'clock, the last customer was usually gone. Your father would sweep the floor himself, wash the combs, wipe down the clippers, fold the towels. He would count what he had made that evening, not dramatically, just practically, the way a man accounts for his day before he ends it. He would put the money away, turn off the light, and come sit with the family for whatever remained of the evening. It was not a barber shop. It was better than that. It was his. Before natural gas heat reached every home, and in many neighborhoods it did not reach at all, in the 1930s, a family needed wood or coal to get through winter. A man who could source it, split it, bag it, and deliver it to your back porch before the first cold snap was a man with steady work from October through March. The coal came from a supplier, usually a yard at the edge of the industrial district where the prices were wholesale, and the men who bought there were the men who resold it. In the neighborhoods, the yard did not service directly. Your father would load the truck or the wagon, haul it back across the city, and break the load down into smaller quantities that individual households could afford and use. A full ton was beyond what most families needed at once. He sold by the half-ton, the quarter-ton, the 50-pound bag, depending on what the customer asked for. The weight of coal is something you do not understand until you have handled it. It is dense in a way that surprises you. A 50-pound bag of coal feels heavier than a 50-pound bag of almost anything else, as if the material has a gravity of its own. Your father had been doing it long enough that he had adjusted his whole body to the work, his back, his legs, his grip, all built around the particular demands of moving dense weight repeatedly across short distances. The wood side of the business required different work. He sourced timber from demolition sites when he could get access, from wooded lots at the edge of the city, from farmers who had cleared land and needed the debris removed. He had a splitting maul and a chopping block in the backyard, and on autumn weekends, the sound of that maul coming down was as regular as the church bells from the Baptist church 3 blocks over. You could hear it from 2 houses away, that clean, heavy crack of wood splitting true, and then the quieter sound of the pieces being stacked. The stacking was important. A pile of wood that was stacked properly in a row against the fence with the pieces interlocked at the ends, for stability and the cut faces outward so the air could reach them, was a pile of wood that would stay dry and burn clean. Your father stacked with the precision of a man who understood that how you stored the work was part of the work itself. His customers called on him in September, before the cold arrived, to place their winter orders. These were the conversations he looked forward to, neighbors coming around to the yard or stopping him on the street to talk through what they needed, how much coal to order this year, whether wood was running cheaper than last winter, whether he could deliver before the end of October. He kept those conversations in a ledger penciled in, the name and the amount and the agreed price, and he worked through the list in order as the season came on. The cold months were long, and the work was physical and relentless. December and January meant he was moving coal and wood constantly, replenishing customers whose supply ran low, picking up new customers referred by the ones he already had. His hands were black from the coal dust, no matter how thoroughly he washed them. Your mother kept a special soap by the back sink, a hard industrial bar, and that soap and those hands are an image that probably sits somewhere in your memory if you think about winter in that house. What he provided was warmth, not metaphorically, actually physically, the warmth that kept a family from being cold in the night. That is not a small thing. In a decade when so many things had become uncertain and so many men had lost the ability to provide, in the ways they were used to providing. Your father came to the back door with a 50-pound bag over his shoulder, and the family stayed warm. That was the whole of it. That was everything. He did not have a sign in the yard. He did not need one. Everybody on the block already knew your father's name when something needed fixing. The loose porch step, the leaking roof, the window that would not close properly, the door frame warped by summer heat. He fixed things. The tools were kept in a wooden box in the basement or the back room, organized in a way that only made complete sense to him, but that he could navigate in the dark. The hammer with the cracked handle that he had wrapped in electrical tape and refused to replace, because the weight of it was exactly right in his hand. The collection of nails sorted by size in old coffee tins with the lids cut off. The hand saw, the level, the pliers in 3 sizes, the adjustable wrench that had been his father's before it was his. He had learned by doing mostly, and by watching men who knew things. The plumber who had lived 3 doors down in the early 20s and who your father had helped on weekend jobs in exchange for being shown how the pipes fit together. The carpenter at the church who had let him hold the other end of the lumber and ask questions while they worked. Knowledge in a community without formal training programs moved that way, person to person, in exchange for labor and time and the willingness to pay attention. A handyman in a black neighborhood in the 1930s operated in a particular context. Most of his customers were renters, and most of their landlords were not responsive to repair requests, or were slow in ways that made a cold winter dangerous and a leaking roof catastrophic. Your father stepped into that gap. He was not undermining anyone. He was keeping families in livable conditions, while the official channels moved at their own unhurried pace. He knew the difference between a repair that was cosmetic and one that was structural. A squeaking floorboard was cosmetic. A joist that had gone soft with water damage was structural and needed to be addressed before someone went through the floor. He had the judgment to make that distinction and the honesty to tell a customer when something was beyond a quick fix, when they needed to pressure the landlord harder or find a way to fund a larger repair. The payment was flexible, and it needed to be. Some customers paid cash on the day, which he preferred. Others paid him over time, a little each week, and he kept a mental account that he never made anyone feel bad about. Others paid in kind, a meal, a jar of preserves, help with something he needed done that they were equipped to do. The economy of the neighborhood in the 1930s was not purely cash, and your father understood that and participated in it without resentment. On a good week, he might do 4 or 5 jobs: a porch railing on Monday, a kitchen pipe on Wednesday, a roof patch on Friday before the next rain came. The work moved, with the weather and the season. Summer meant porch work and window screens. Winter meant pipes and drafts and the particular desperation of a family whose only heat source had stopped working. He went out in the cold for those calls without being asked twice. There is something in the image of your father walking up to a neighbor's door with his wooden toolbox, knocking, being let in, getting to work in somebody else's kitchen or basement, doing the thing that needed doing and leaving the place better than he found it. That was a kind of service that went beyond money, though the money mattered too. He was the reason the neighborhood held together, one repaired step at a time. On Friday nights in some houses, the furniture got moved, the good tablecloth came out, and men arrived at the back door with their contributions, a bottle or a few dollars, and stayed until nearly morning. Your father was not a gambler. He was the house. The man who ran the game did not play in it. He provided the space, the safety, the quiet order, and he took a modest cut from every pot. The preparations started in the afternoon. The kitchen table extended with the leaf that lived against the wall the rest of the week. Chairs brought in from the bedroom and the front room to seat 6 or 8. A lamp position where it threw good light on the table without glare. The good cards, a fresh deck or two kept in the sideboard drawer, brought out only for Fridays. The ashtrays placed at intervals around the table. A bottle on the counter and glasses turned upside down on a cloth beside it. Your father had a sense of hospitality that expressed itself in preparation. The men who came to his game came partly because of the game and partly because of him. Because being in his house felt like being somewhere that was managed well, where the temperature was right and the whiskey was honest, and nobody was going to cause a problem, because everybody understood that causing a problem meant not being invited back. He knew which men to invite and which men to keep away from each other. That knowledge was social intelligence of a high order, understanding the dynamics and the histories and the tensions in a community well enough to curate a room where none of those tensions boiled over. A Friday night game that ended in an argument was bad for business and bad for the neighborhood. His games did not end in arguments. He had an instinct for when the temperature was rising and a way of redirecting it, a joke, a refill, a change in the conversation that brought things back to level before they tipped. The games were bid whist, tonk, poker in various forms, Georgia skin. These were not casual diversions. The men who played them were serious about the game and expected seriousness in return. Your father kept the game honest. He did not tolerate cheating, not because he was naive about what went on in other games around the city, but because his game's reputation for being clean was its primary asset. Men came back to a game they trusted. The cut he took from each pot was small, understood, and never discussed. That was the etiquette. You did not talk about the house percentage the way you did not talk about certain other arrangements that kept the neighborhood functioning. It was simply part of the structure of the evening, and everyone accepted it as such, because it was fair compensation for the space, the setup, the safety, and the company. Your mother had her own arrangement with Fridays. She might visit her sister on those evenings, or retire early to the back of the house with the children. She was not excluded from the knowledge of what happened on Fridays. She was a partner in the household economy and understood exactly what Friday nights contributed to it. There was no deception between them on this subject. It was business conducted at home, with her full awareness. By 2 a.m, the last hand had been played, and the men filtered out the back door, the same way they had come in, quietly, not wanting to wake the street. Your father would clear the table, count the take, wash the glasses, fold the tablecloth. The house went quiet. He sat for a moment in the kitchen before turning out the light, in the particular stillness of a room that had been full of men and laughter and now held only the memory of it. Then he went to bed. He woke up before the city did. The wholesale market opened at 4 a.m, and your father was already there with a cart or a truck, buying what was freshest and cheapest, and loading it before the retail stores had even raised their gates. By 7, he was on the block, calling out what he had, and the neighborhood women came to the curb with their coins. The wholesale market in the morning was a world unto itself, loud and fast, and completely focused on the business of food moving from growers and distributors to the men and women who would carry it the last mile to the people who ate it. Wooden, crates stacked higher than your head. The smell of earth still on the potatoes. The sharp green smell of collard greens bound in bundles. Peaches that filled the whole area around them with a sweetness that hit you before you even saw them. Your father moved through it quickly, knowing what he was looking for, knowing what would sell today in the specific neighborhood he served. He had an eye for what was right. A tomato that was a day past its best was a tomato he did not buy. Not because he was precious about it, but because his customers trusted him. The women on the block who bought from him had been buying from him for 3 years, and they had learned that what came off his cart was good. That reputation was worth more than the few cents he might have saved buying second quality. The loading was part science and part instinct. Heavy things on the bottom, fragile things on top. Everything arranged so that when he reached for a particular item in the middle of the street, he could find it without unpacking half the cart. He could lift a crate of peaches to get to the greens underneath without bruising either one. That kind of spatial intelligence was learned the same way all his knowledge was learned, by doing it wrong a few times and then doing it right for the rest of his life. The route through the neighborhood was not fixed in the way a bus route is fixed. He went where he knew the people were, where the morning foot traffic gathered, where the women who cooked the family meals would be passing on their way back from the early mass or the first errand of the day. He called out what he had in a voice that carried, not a shout exactly, more a projection, the practiced voice of a man who had learned to be heard over street noise without sounding like he was straining. The transactions were fast and warm at the same time. How much for the greens? 15 cents a bundle. I got 3. Here is 40 cents. Keep the extra. His hands were in constant motion, weighing, wrapping in paper, making change from the pouch on his hip, with a speed that came from doing it hundreds of times. He knew most of his customers by name, and they knew him, and the exchange was always both a purchase and a small social moment. A question about a child, a comment about the weather, a piece of neighborhood information that circulated through the morning like the produce itself. By midday, the cart was mostly empty, and what was left he would sometimes take to the back door of a church or a boarding house, selling the remainder at a discount rather than hauling it back. Waste was not something he accepted when it could be converted. Whatever he brought home was eaten that night. The produce hustle was not glamorous work. It was early and physical and dependent on weather and season, in ways that most other work was not. But it put food in front of people who needed it at prices they could meet, carried to their street by a man they knew and trusted. In a city that did not always bring its best to their neighborhood, your father brought his. Some men ran laundry out of the house because their wives knew how to do it better than anyone in the city. Other men ran it because they themselves had learned the trade and understood that a clean, pressed shirt in the 1930s was not a luxury. It was how a man walked into a job interview, a church service, a courtroom, or a first date. The back porch, or the kitchen, was the laundry room. The wash tubs were galvanized steel, 2 of them, one for washing and one for rinsing, heavy enough that moving them full required real effort. The washboard leaned against the wall between uses, its corrugated zinc surface worn smooth in the places where the most work happened. The soap was lye-based and hard and smelled nothing like the gentle detergents that would come later. It smelled like clean in the most fundamental way, caustic and honest. Your father, or your mother alongside him, worked the shirts by hand, collar first, because the collar was where the soil concentrated, then the cuffs, then the body of the shirt worked against the board in long strokes, the water going gray with the week's work coming out of the fabric. The rinse was thorough. Soap left in a shirt made it stiff and wrong when it dried, and a stiff collar was not the same as a pressed collar. The line in the backyard ran the length of the fence, and sometimes past it. A second line strung between the fence post and the shed. Shirts hung by the tail so the collar and cuffs dried without clip marks. White shirts were hung in the sun deliberately because sunlight bleached fabric back toward white in a way nothing else quite replicated. By afternoon, the line was full, and the shirts moved in the wind like flags of something domestic and proud. The pressing was its own skill. The iron was a flat iron, heated on the stove, tested on a damp cloth to make sure the temperature was right, and then moved across the fabric in long, deliberate strokes, steam rising where the iron met the damp cloth laid over the garment. A shirt pressed wrong was worse than a shirt unironed, with lines where there should be none and missing the crispness that made the whole operation worth doing. Your father pressed a shirt correctly the first time, every time, because his hands knew the pressure and the angle the way a musician knows the instrument. The customers were mostly working men who wore dress shirts on days that required it, but who had neither the time nor, in some cases, the equipment to do the work themselves. Bachelors were the steadiest customers. A man living alone in a rooming house with no access to a proper wash tub, and no woman in the household brought his shirts once a week and picked them up 2 days later, starched and pressed and folded in paper. Your father charged by the piece. A shirt was a certain amount, trousers a certain amount, a suit jacket slightly more. He kept the prices honest because the neighborhood could feel when a price was fair and when it was taking advantage, and he was not in the business of taking advantage of the people he lived among. What he was doing, at its core, was giving men their dignity back in a very concrete form. A pressed shirt was armor. It was the thing between a man and the way the world read him when he walked through a door. Your father understood this because he lived it himself, the way a good shirt changed the posture of the man wearing it, the way the collar sitting right against the neck made a man hold his head a certain way. He ironed that into every piece he sent back out the door, and the men who wore those shirts carried it with them into the morning. Not every musician in the 1930s was chasing a record deal or a club residency. Most of them were simply good, and good was enough to earn on weekends. Your father played something, maybe piano, maybe guitar, maybe upright bass, and he played it at house parties, church socials, fish fries, and Saturday night dances in somebody's rented hall. He had learned the instrument the way most self-taught musicians of that era learned it, by ear, by repetition, by sitting close enough to someone better than him and watching the hands until the hands made sense. There were no lesson books in the house, or if there were, they were supplementary to the real education, which happened in real time, in real rooms, with real people responding to what he played. Music in the 1930s. Black community was not a performance separate from daily life. It was woven into it, into the church, the kitchen, the front porch on summer evenings, the radio when the radio was on. His instrument had a history. If it was a guitar, he had bought it second-hand from a man who was moving north and could not take everything. If it was a piano, it had come into the house through some combination of negotiation and luck and had been tuned by a man who came once a year and charged $2 and left the instrument sounding like something new. Whatever it was, your father treated it with a seriousness that communicated its importance without anyone needing to explain it. You did not put things on top of it. You did not touch it without asking. The jobs came through word of mouth, which is the only way music jobs moved in the 1930s in most black communities. A woman planning a birthday celebration asked the woman next door who played at her daughter's party 2 months ago, and the answer came back to your father through a chain of 3 or 4 people in the span of a day. He would show up on a Saturday evening with his instrument and whatever he needed to support it, picks, rosin, an extra string coiled in his breast pocket, and he would set up in whatever corner of whatever room he had been given, and he would begin. The repertoire was wide because it had to be. A house party in 1934 might want jubilant dance music early in the evening and something slower and more melancholy by midnight, when the whiskey had been going for a few hours, and the mood had shifted the way moods shift when a room full of people has been together long enough to stop performing and start feeling. Your father could read a room the way he read a piece of music, anticipating where it was going before it got there, shaping what he played to what the room needed rather than what he had planned. He was not the loudest man in any room he played. That was not his style. His style was to hold the musical center steady while the room moved around it, to be the thing people returned to between conversations and dances and trips to the kitchen. The musicians who tried to dominate a house party usually got in the way of it. Your father understood his role as service, not spectacle. What he earned on a weekend night was modest, $2 or $3 for an evening, sometimes more if the host was generous, or the party ran long and everyone had a good time. But it added to the weekly sum in a way that mattered, and it added it through something he loved, which was not nothing. In a decade when most work was just work, being paid for something you would have done anyway, in some form, on some evening, was a particular kind of grace. The music stayed in the house after the jobs were done. Saturday nights, when he was not hired out, he played at home. You fell asleep to it sometimes, the sound coming from the front room while the rest of the house was dark, your father playing something quiet and unhurried for no audience at all, just because the instrument was there and the evening was long and the music was his. By the 1930s, a portable camera was within reach for a man who saved carefully and understood the value of what he held. Black families in this era photographed themselves with intention. Every Sunday portrait, every graduation, every new baby, every man in a uniform, before he shipped out. Those moments needed to be caught by someone who would come to you, set up his equipment in the front room, and hand you something you could keep. The camera itself was likely a folding camera, a Kodak of some model, compact enough to carry in a case over the shoulder, but capable of producing a print with real clarity and depth when handled by someone who knew what they were doing. Your father knew what he was doing. He had learned the technical side from reading, from a library book checked out so many times the spine had gone soft, and from trial and error through rolls of film he could not entirely afford to waste, and therefore did not waste. Film in the 1930s was not forgiving. You had a finite number of exposures on a roll, and each one cost something in a literal accounting sense, before you even knew whether the image had come out. That constraint made your father deliberate in a way that modern photography, with its unlimited digital frames, cannot quite replicate. He looked at a scene before he raised the camera. He thought about the light, where it was coming from, how it fell on the face of the person he was photographing, whether the background was clean or cluttered. He composed before he clicked, and when he clicked, it was because he was ready. The dark room was a bathroom or a closet, made light tight with felt strips along the door edges and a red bulb in the socket for the safe light. The smell of the developer chemicals was sharp and particular, a smell that never fully left the house on the days he was printing, that worked its way into the curtains and the towels and was simply understood as the smell of your father's work on those days. You would watch sometimes through the cracked door as the image appeared on the paper in the developer tray, rising up from white blankness like something remembered, the face of a neighbor's grandmother becoming visible in the red light, slow and then all at once, His customers came to him for the occasions that mattered. A family portrait on Easter Sunday, everyone in their best clothes, the children arranged by height, the parents standing behind them with the particular formal posture people assumed for photographs in that era, as if the camera required a certain dignity in return for what it offered. He would set up near a window for the natural light, arrange the group, talk to the children enough to get them still without making them stiff, and take 3 or 4 frames to make sure he had one that was right. He charged by the sitting and by the number of prints ordered. The pricing was modest, because it had to be modest for the neighborhood to use him. But it was enough because the neighborhood used him consistently. Weddings, graduations, first communions, new babies, men in new suits, women in new dresses. These occasions came around regularly enough that his camera was never idle for long. What he gave his community was permanence. A photograph in the 1930s was not a casual thing. It was not one of 10,000 images on a telephone, easily forgotten. It was a deliberate object, framed and placed on the mantel, or tucked carefully into an envelope and mailed to a relative in another city. It said that this moment happened and that the people in it were worth remembering. Your father said that with every print he pulled from the developer tray and held up to the light, he said it about his neighbors, about their children, about their lives. That was the whole of the work. Prohibition ended in 1933, but the bootlegging economy did not end cleanly. Dry counties remained. Taxes on legal liquor made homemade product cheaper, and a man who knew how to run a still or who had connections to someone who did could move product quietly through the neighborhood long after repeal. Your father was careful. He was not reckless. He was running a business. The still, if he ran one, was not in the house. That was the first rule, and the most important one. It was in a shed at the edge of a property he had access to, or in the back room of a building where the arrangement with the owner was understood and compensated. The equipment was simple: a copper pot, a coiled tube for condensing, a collection vessel, a heat source that could be controlled. The simplicity of the setup was part of its genius. It could be broken down and moved in under an hour if it needed to be. The product he made was corn whiskey mostly, because corn was cheap and available, and the result was something people wanted. He did not pretend it was something it was not. It was not bourbon aged in a barrel in Kentucky. It was what it was, strong and clear, and made by a man who took the process seriously enough that it would not make you sick, which was not a guarantee you could make about every bootlegger's product, and which was therefore a genuine selling point. The distribution was quiet and personal. He did not stand on a corner. He did not advertise. He had customers who knew to come to the back door on certain evenings, who knocked in a particular way, who received a bottle in a paper bag and left something in return that was never called what it was in any conversation that could be overheard. The language of the transaction was its own dialect, casual and opaque, entirely comprehensible to both parties and entirely unclear to anyone else. He knew the enforcement landscape of his neighborhood the way a sailor knows the weather, which officers were strict and which ones were manageable, which nights were safer than others. He did not operate on the nights that were not safe, and he did not test boundaries that did not need testing. Discretion was not timidity. It was intelligence applied to risk management. The money was better than most legal work he could find, and that was a fact he held without particular guilt in a decade when the legal economy had made clear it was not especially interested in making room for him. He was not naive about what he was doing or about the larger moral questions that surrounded it. But he was also feeding a family in the middle of the Great Depression, in a country that had recently decided to make the thing he was selling legal again in most places, in a neighborhood where the demand was real and the suppliers were going to exist regardless of whether he was one of them or not. He kept it contained. He did not expand beyond what he could manage safely. He did not bring anyone into the operation who did not have the sense and the discipline to keep it quiet. And when the conditions changed, when the risk shifted or the economics stopped making sense, he would set it down the same way he had picked it up, practically and without drama. Your father was not defined by this hustle any more than he was defined by any single thing he did to hold the household together. It was one tool among many that a resourceful man used in a difficult time, and he used it carefully, and he came home every night and the family ate. That was the standard by which he measured himself. The church in the 1930s. Black community was not merely a spiritual institution, it was a financial one. A man with the gift of preaching and the trust of a congregation could build something from almost nothing. A storefront church, a backyard revival, a traveling tent ministry. The collection plate on a good Sunday could feed a family for a week. The gift showed up before the ministry did. Your father had a voice that changed when he was moved by something, that took on a resonance and a rhythm that came from somewhere deeper than conversation. He had known it since he was young, that when he stood up in front of people and spoke about something he believed, the room changed. People leaned forward. Children went quiet. Even the skeptical ones found themselves listening. He had not set out to be a preacher in the formal sense. The formal sense required a church that belonged to a denomination that had its own structures and hierarchies and pathways that were not always open to a man without seminary training. What he had instead was a community that needed what he offered, which was the weekly gathering, the scripture, the exhortation, the music, the collective act of sitting together and being reminded that the current difficulty was not the final word on any of their lives. The storefront church was rented space, a former dry goods store or a vacant commercial room with enough square footage to fit 30 or 40 chairs. He would clean it himself on Saturday, set the chairs in rows, put a pulpit at the front that might have been nothing more than a solid wooden box draped with cloth. Sunday morning he would be there early, the door open, ready to receive whoever came. The congregation built slowly, the way all genuine things build, by word spreading from one person who had been help to another person who needed help, a woman whose husband had recently died and who needed somewhere to bring her grief, a family new to the city from the South who had not yet found a church home, young men who were skeptical of organized religion, but who found something in your father's preaching that did not feel like performance, that felt like a man saying true things in a direct way. He preached without notes most Sundays. He had a text, a scripture he had been turning over all week, and he let the sermon grow from that text the way a tree grows from a seed, not in a straight, predictable line, but outward and upward in the direction of the available light. The congregation responded as black congregations have always responded, not as passive recipients of information, but as participants in the making of the sermon, their responses shaping his direction, calling him forward or deeper, depending on where the Spirit was moving in the room. The collection plate came around toward the end of the service. He never begged over it. He did not make anyone feel guilty for what they gave or did not give. He trusted that the people in his congregation were giving what they could, and that what they could was enough, and in most weeks it was enough, not abundant, but enough, because the congregation understood that the church only existed as long as they made it exist. What he built was small by the standards of the great black churches of the era. But the people who came to it on Sunday morning came home from it different, steadied, reminded of something they were in danger of forgetting during the week. Your father gave them that. He gave it freely, and it came back to him in the collection plate and in the meals pressed on him at the door, and in the loyalty of a congregation that showed up every Sunday as long as he was there to open the door. Your mother sewed. Maybe she had always sewn. Took in alterations, made dresses for women in the neighborhood who could not afford department store prices, but wanted to look the part on Sunday. Your father was the logistics. He picked up the fabric, delivered the finished work, collected the payment, and kept the book. The partnership was not discussed in formal terms. It did not need to be. It had evolved from the natural arrangement of two people who each had different abilities and who had been living alongside each other long enough to understand how those abilities fit together without a meeting being called about it. Your mother's hands knew fabric. Your father's feet knew the neighborhood. Together, they ran something that neither could have run as efficiently alone. His morning might begin at the dry goods store, where the fabric bolts stood upright in wooden racks, flannel and cotton, and seersucker and wool crepe, in colors that your mother had specified, with a precision that left no room for interpretation. She had developed her eye over years of handling cloth, and she knew exactly what she needed before he left the house. He would pull the bolt, have the woman behind the counter cut the length, roll it and wrap it in brown paper, and carry it home under his arm. The delivery side was where the social skill came in. Returning a finished dress to a customer was not a simple transaction. The customer had been waiting, had a Sunday, or a wedding, or a funeral that the dress was meant for, had been thinking about whether the hem was going to be right and whether the darts were going to sit correctly. Your father arrived at the door with the dress folded in tissue paper in a box. And the way he arrived, the steadiness of him, the calm confidence that the work was right, because your mother's work was always right, transferred to the customer before she even opened the box. He collected payment with the same ease. He did not present a bill dramatically. He simply received what was owed with a nod and a thank you and noted it in the small ledger he kept in his coat pocket. A ledger that your mother reviewed every evening to reconcile against what she remembered, agreeing to. Between the two of them, no payment was ever lost, and no customer was ever overcharged, and no debt went untracked longer than it needed to. He also managed the customer relationships in his way, which was different from your mother's way. She built the relationships through the fittings, through the intimate and focused attention she gave each woman who came to the house to be measured, through the skill that made those women trust her with their most important occasions. He built the relationships through the street, through the fact that he knew every family on 12 blocks and they knew him, and that when a woman needed a dress made and was deciding between your mother and the woman on the next street over, the fact that she saw your father every other day and trusted him was not a small consideration. The book was his contribution to the business in the most literal sense. He tracked what had been ordered, what had been promised by when, what had been paid, and what remained. Your mother could sew 8 hours a day and not worry about whether the accounting was right because she knew it was right. That freedom was what he gave her, the freedom to do the work she was best at without also having to be the person who managed all the work around the work. In the evenings, they would sit together and review the week, what was coming in, what needed to go out, whether to raise prices on the more complex pieces, whether the cost of fabric had shifted enough to require an adjustment. It was a business meeting conducted at the kitchen table after the children were in bed, in the language of two people who had built something together and intended to keep it standing. He rang a bell or called out from the street, and people brought things to the curb. Old metal, broken appliances, worn-out tools, scrap copper stripped from demolished buildings. Your father had an eye for what was worth something and what was not, and he had a buyer at the salvage yard who trusted his loads. The call was distinctive. Every junk man in every neighborhood had a particular cadence to his call, a specific rhythm of words that the neighborhood came to associate with him specifically, the way you can recognize a voice without seeing a face. Your father's call was low and caring, not a shout, but a projection that moved down the block and into the houses on both sides. People heard it from their back rooms. Children heard it from upstairs. The word traveled faster than he walked. The cart or the truck moved slowly enough for people to get to the door and see him and decide whether they had something. He was never in a hurry on the route, because hurry communicated indifference, and indifference cost him material that was sitting in somebody's basement, waiting for a reason to be brought out. He moved at the pace of a man who had time for what you had, because he did have time, and because what you had was exactly what he was looking for. He could assess value in a glance. Cast iron was worth more than tin. Copper was worth more than cast iron. Brass was worth more than copper in some configurations. The weight and purity of the metal determined the price at the salvage yard, and he knew those prices, and he knew how to look at a piece of scrap and calculate roughly what it would become in someone else's hands, in the foundry, in the remanufacture of something new. The junk man was not the end of the story for what he collected. He was a link in a chain that turned the discarded into the reusable. The relationships he built along his route were long ones. A family that had given him a broken wringer washer in the spring would have him in mind when the radiator finally gave out in the fall. He was the person they thought of when something stopped working and they needed it to disappear. He made the problem disappear, and he paid something for the privilege of doing so, which made him the rarest kind of person in anyone's economic life, the man who solved your problem and left money on the counter when he was done. The salvage yard buyer was a relationship he had cultivated over years. The buyer knew that your father's loads were clean, that he did not mix worthless material in with the good stuff to inflate the weight, that the copper was copper and not copper over iron, that the cast iron was not cracked in ways that reduced its usefulness. That reputation for honesty was worth real money at the scale he operated. A buyer who trusted you paid you faster and argued with you less, and that efficiency compounded over time into a meaningful advantage. Some days the route was thin. The neighborhood had given what it had to give for that week, and there was not much at the curb. He did not force it. He would extend the route, go a block or two further than usual, knock on doors he had not knocked on before, introduce himself to streets that did not yet know his call. The territory of a junk man was not fixed. It grew en benanzim, proportion to his willingness to go looking. He came home in the afternoon with the truck or the cart lighter and his pocket heavier, smelling of rust and metal and the particular outdoor smell of a man who had been moving through the city all morning. He washed at the sink in the back. He sat down, and whatever the day had produced was entered into the account of the week. Another day met, another contribution made to the household that bore his name. Cars were becoming more common by the 1930s, and a man who could fix one was never without work. Your father did not have a shop. He had a driveway, a set of tools he had accumulated carefully over years, and a reputation that spread from one mouth to the next through every neighborhood he had ever lived in. The education had been self-directed and relentless. He had started with the Model T, which was in some ways the perfect teaching machine, because it was simple enough to be fully comprehensible to a man willing to spend enough time with it, and because there were enough of them in the world that problems encountered and solved. On one were problems he would encounter and solve again on another. He read the manuals when he could get them. He talked to other men who knew things. He took engines apart that did not need to be taken apart simply to understand how the pieces related to each other. The driveway operation had its own rhythm. A car would pull up, sometimes the neighbor from 2 streets over, sometimes a man who had been referred by someone his father had never met, and your father would listen before he touched anything. He listened to the engine. He listened to the description the owner gave of what had gone wrong and when, and under what conditions. He asked questions in the manner of a diagnostician, not to fill silence, but to narrow the field of possibilities before he invested time in ruling them out. The tools were laid out on a cloth beside the car, arranged in a way that was specific to him and not necessarily legible to anyone else, but that allowed him to reach for something without looking and find it where he expected it to be. The wrenches by size, largest to smallest. The screwdrivers grouped by type. The rags folded and stacked, because a rag folded and stacked was easier to find than a rag thrown in a pile. Small disciplines that accumulated into the habit of precision. He worked in all weather, because the cars that needed fixing did not wait for good weather. In the heat of July, he worked with a rag over his shoulder and water nearby. In the cold of November, he wore an old coat over his work clothes and warmed the oil before he changed it so it would flow. He did not complain about the weather to his customers because the customer was already inconvenienced, and adding his discomfort to theirs solved nothing. The pricing was fair, and it was always explained before the work began. He told you what he thought the problem was, what he would need to do about it, and what it would cost, and he waited for your agreement before he started. If he got into the job and found something additional that needed attention, he stopped and told you before he continued. No surprises at the end. This was not merely courtesy. It was the business model. A customer who had never been surprised by a bill became a customer who sent other customers. Word moved in circles through the neighborhood and beyond it. A man whose car your father had fixed told his brother-in-law, who worked on the other side of the city, and now that brother-in-law drove across town, because the man he trusted was worth the distance. Your father never had a sign in the yard. He never took out an advertisement. His work was the advertisement, and it was running constantly, in every car that left the driveway repaired and returned to the road. In the evenings after the last car was done, he would wash the grease from his hands with a brush and a bar of lava soap, working the bristles into the creases of his knuckles where the oil settled deepest. The hands were never entirely clean until the season was over, but they were capable hands, and he knew it, and you knew it, and everyone who had ever put their car in that driveway and gotten it back running knew it too. There is a distinction worth making between a man who shines shoes wherever he is allowed and a man who owns his corner. In the 1930s, certain corners in certain cities were understood to belong to particular men, not legally, not on paper, but in the way that mattered, which was in the understanding of everyone who passed through. Your father's corner had been chosen with the care of a man who understood foot traffic the way a merchant understands inventory. He needed a corner where men in leather shoes were moving in numbers and moving with enough purpose in their day that they would stop for a shine rather than put it off until later. Later almost never came. The courthouse steps, the block outside a EE. Busy bank, the corner adjacent to a hotel where traveling salesmen came in and out all day. These were the corners worth having. He had arrived at this corner before there was anything to arrive at. The first weeks he set up his box and worked whatever came his way, and it was not much. But he came back the next day, and the day after that, and the week after that, and slowly the corner began to associate him with it. The way places take on the character of the people who inhabit them consistently enough. The doorman at the hotel began sending men his way. The courthouse bailiff mentioned him to lawyers who mentioned him to other lawyers. The box he worked from was his. That was important. Not a shared kit, not a borrowed setup. His box, his polish, his brushes, his cloth. He had invested in good materials because good materials produced a better shine, and a better shine produced a better reputation, and a better reputation produced more customers. The investment logic was clear to him, even if it required him to spend carefully at the beginning when careful spending was not easy. He could do a shine in 4 minutes when the line was moving. Not 4 minutes of rushing, but 4 minutes of efficient, practiced motion. The polish application, the brushwork, the buffing, the edge detail. The final wipe with the soft cloth that brought up the mirror finish that made a man look down at his shoes and stand a little differently. He knew when a customer wanted conversation and when they wanted to read their newspaper in peace. He read it in the first 10 seconds and adjusted accordingly. The corner also functioned as a kind of post. He knew what was moving through that block. He knew who was going to the courthouse and why, roughly. He knew which businessmen were in town and which regulars had not come by in a while. The information that passed through him was not gossip in the way that word is used disparagingly. It was the intelligence of a man who paid close attention to the world he occupied, who knew the patterns of his specific piece of the city, and who was trusted enough by the people around him that they spoke freely in his presence. There were other bootblacks in the city who worked better corners or busier corners. He was not the most prosperous man in his trade, but he was consistent, and consistency over years produced something that prosperity alone does not always produce, which was permanence. His corner was his corner for a decade. Men came back to him specifically, not to any bootblack who happened to be there, but to him, because they knew him and trusted the work and had been coming back long enough that stopping now would have felt like a loss. He packed up at the same time every afternoon, wrapped the cloths, closed the tins, folded the box, and walked the same route home through the same streets he had been walking for years. The neighborhood knew him by sight on that walk. He knew it back. That mutual recognition, quiet and unhurried, was the return on years of showing up. Not every man in the 1930s could read or write at the level required for the letters that needed writing. Correspondence with a landlord, a legal complaint, a letter to a family member in the North or the South, a petition to a city office. Your father had the education and the hand, and he sat across from his neighbors at the kitchen table and gave their words the form they needed. Literacy in black communities in the 1930s varied widely, depending on the region, the generation, and the access to schooling that the Depression had often further disrupted. A man who had completed schooling through the higher grades was not unusual in the city neighborhoods of the North, but he was not universal either, and the gap between what a person needed to communicate in writing and what they were able to produce on their own was a gap with real consequences. A letter to a landlord written poorly might be ignored. A letter written well might produce results. Your father had good handwriting. This was not a trivial thing in the era before typewriters were common in private homes. Penmanship was still legible information about a person, about their education and their care, and their intention to be taken seriously. He had practiced it in school and continued to practice it because he understood its value. His letters did not look like a man asking for something. They looked like a man stating a position, and that posture in the writing communicated itself to whoever read it. He would sit across from his neighbor, whoever had come to the kitchen table, with a need, and he would listen first. Just listen. The situation with the landlord who had not fixed the boiler for 3 weeks now. The confusion about a bill from the city that did not seem to add up correctly. The need to reach a sister in Mississippi who had not written in 2 months and who someone was beginning to worry about. He let the person speak until they had said everything they needed to say. And then he asked the questions that helped him understand what the letter needed to accomplish. That was the craft of it. Not just the writing, but the framing, the understanding of what outcome the person wanted and how to structure the letter so that it moved the reader toward that outcome rather than away from it. A complaint letter that was too emotional gave the recipient something to dismiss. A complaint letter that was specific, measured, and clear about what was being requested, and by when gave the recipient a path to resolution that was easier to take than to refuse. He wrote the letter once in draft, reading it back to the person who had brought the need, asking whether this was what they meant, whether there was something left out or something that should be taken out. This part mattered. The letter was not his. It was theirs. His job was to give it the form it needed without changing whose voice it was. The best letters he wrote were the ones where the person who had brought him the situation heard their own intentions coming back to them in language they wished they had been able to find themselves. He did not charge much. For a neighbor in genuine difficulty, sometimes he charged nothing. For a longer piece of work, a formal complaint or a document that required multiple drafts, something modest changed hands. The compensation was never the primary motivation. The primary motivation was the same one that had brought him to his own education in the first place. The conviction that language was power, that the ability to put the right words in the right order was the ability to move through a world that was not always arranged in your favor and find purchase in it anyway. Years later, there would be people in the neighborhood who had a document in a drawer, a response from a landlord or a city official or a relative far away, that had come because your father sat down with them and found the words. They kept those letters. They kept them because they had worked, and because they were proof that someone had thought their situation worth the careful attention it deserved. Black social life in the 1930s was rich, organized, and constant. Fraternal orders, women's clubs, church anniversaries, graduation dinners, wedding receptions. These events needed food, real food, prepared in quantity and served with care. Your father and your mother together could put a spread on a table that people talked about for months. The kitchen in your house, on the days before a catering job, was a different kind of place than it was on ordinary days. It was louder, hotter, more purposeful. The smell was layered in a way that hit you when you came in from outside. The deep, slow smell of something braised, the sharp top note of onion going into a pan, the sweet undertone of a cake cooling on the rack by the window. Everything happened at once, and your mother moved through it with the efficiency of a person who had thought through every step before the first pot was on the stove. Your father's role in the preparation was specific. He was not the cook. That was understood and respected. He was the butcher and the hauler and the setup man and the front of house. He went to the market the day before and came back with a quantity of chicken and pork and greens and everything else that had been discussed and agreed upon. He carried the heavy things. He washed the larger equipment. He loaded the vehicle the morning of the event with everything in the order it would be needed. The equipment first, the food packed carefully on top. The events themselves had a particular formality that required something different from him than the market did. He put on the good clothes for the delivery and setup, not because the fraternal order cared what he wore when he carried a pot through the door, but because he cared, and because the way you presented yourself when you were doing work for a community that knew you was a statement about how you regarded that community. He could set a table. This is a skill that sounds simple and is not. The cloth laid without wrinkles, the plates at a consistent distance from the edge, the serving pieces in the right positions relative to what they were serving, the garnish that made the whole table look like it had been arranged by someone who understood that the eye eats before the mouth does. He had watched your mother do it and had done it enough times alongside her that his hands knew the sequence. The serving, when there was serving, was another performance. Moving through a room with a large dish, offering it to each guest, refilling without being asked, reading the table, to know who needed the next thing before they thought to ask for it. The good server was invisible in the sense that the meal flowed without friction, and nobody had to think about the service because it was always there when it was needed and never in the way when it was not. After the event was over and the guests had gone and the hosts were left with the warm satisfaction of a successful gathering, your father and your mother would break down the setup, wash and pack the equipment, carry it back to the vehicle, and drive home through streets that were quieter now because it was late. They were tired in the particular way of people who have done something well and completely, the fatigue that is next door to satisfaction. What they built through the catering work was more than income. It was a presence at the center of community life, an association with the occasions that people marked and remembered. When a woman in the neighborhood thought about her daughter's graduation dinner, she thought about your parents. When a church committee discussed the anniversary banquet, your parents' names came up first. That positioning, earned through consistent and excellent work, was a kind of social capital that compounded quietly over the years into something that looked a lot like belonging. He came through the neighborhood on a schedule, pushing a grinding wheel mounted on a cart or a bicycle frame, ringing a small bell, or calling out in a voice that carried half a block. Knives, scissors, straight razors, garden shears. Everything in a household that had an edge eventually needed tending. The grinding wheel was the center of the operation, and it was a thing worth looking at. A stone wheel mounted on a spindle, connected by a belt or a pedal mechanism to a foot treadle that your father pumped to keep the wheel turning at the right speed. The whole assembly was compact enough to be pushed through streets and narrow alleys, but heavy enough that you felt its weight going uphill. He had built part of it himself, modified the cart frame to distribute the weight evenly so the wheel did not tip on uneven pavement, added a water reservoir that dripped onto the stone to keep it cool during the work. The sound of the wheel running was unmistakable, a high sustained tone that changed pitch when a blade made contact with the stone, dropping slightly as the metal engaged, then rising again as the angle was perfected and the grinding found its rhythm. Children on the block recognized the sound before they saw him and came running, not to bring knives, but simply because the wheel was something to watch. The shower of small sparks when the angle was steeper, the smooth, circular motion, the way your father's face concentrated without going tense. He had learned the trade from a man who had worked it for 30 years and who had the particular confidence of someone who has done one thing long enough that the technique has become instinct. The angle of the blade against the wheel was everything. Too steep and you ground away more metal than necessary, shortening the useful life of the knife faster than it needed to be shortened. Too shallow and you raised a wire edge that felt sharp in the moment and went dull within the day. The correct angle was specific to the blade, to its intended use, to the steel it was made from, and your father carried all of that knowledge in his hands, rather than in words he could easily recite. A housewife's kitchen knife was different from a butcher's knife. A butcher's knife was different from a straight razor. A straight razor was different from a pair of dressmaking scissors. He adjusted the wheel speed, the water flow, the angle, the pressure, the finishing stroke, all of it customized to what was in his hands. Watching him work was watching someone translate between a general skill and an infinite variety of specific applications. And the translation was so fluid that it looked like simply doing one thing rather than the 100 decisions it actually contained. The customers came to the curb or called him from their doorways. He stopped, set the brake on the cart, and received what they brought him. He looked at each blade before he touched it to the wheel, assessing the damage, the dullness, the nicks that needed to be ground out before the edge could be rebuilt. He would tell you what he found and what he intended to do, and occasionally he would tell you kindly that a blade had been used in ways it was not designed for, and that was why the edge had failed in the particular way it had failed. Not a lecture, an observation offered as information you might find useful. The charge was small, a few cents per blade, a dime for a full set of kitchen knives. The smallness of the charge was offset by the volume of the work and the frequency of return customers. A set of kitchen knives sharpened in the spring would need attention again by fall. A straight razor, if used daily, came back every few months. The relationship between the sharpener and the household was a long one, measured not in single transactions, but in the accumulated years of blades made useful again. He was providing something that touched every meal a family cooked, every piece of fabric a seamstress cut. Every morning a man shaved before work. His work was invisible in the way that all maintenance work is invisible when it is done well, felt only in its absence when it was not done. The knife that cut cleanly through a chicken did not announce that your father had been through the neighborhood last Tuesday. But the cook who used it knew, in her hands, the difference between a blade that had been cared for and one that had not. He came home in the afternoon with stone dust on his apron and the quiet satisfaction of a man whose work had a clear and measurable result. Dull things made sharp. That was the whole of it. In a decade when so much felt unresolvable and stuck, there was something quietly radical about a man who took the blunted and the worn and returned them to usefulness, one blade at a time. This is distinct from the numbers runner. The policy banker was the man further up the chain. He did not run slips through the neighborhood. He bankrolled the operation, paid out the winners, absorbed the losses, and managed the risk. In some black neighborhoods in the 1930s, the policy banker was the most financially powerful man on the street. To be the banker required capital first, enough to cover a bad week when the winning numbers hit multiple times and the payouts exceeded the intake. A runner who had a bad week lost nothing but commissions. The banker who had a bad week reached into his own reserves and paid every winner without delay, because paying promptly was not just ethical practice, it was the entire foundation of the operation's credibility. A banker who was slow to pay was a banker whose runners started looking for a different house to work under. Your father had accumulated the starting capital through years of smaller hustles, through careful saving, through the discipline of a man who understood that the distance between working for the operation and owning a piece of the operation was exactly the distance between having enough reserve and not having it. He had watched the men above him in the chain long enough to understand both how the business worked and what qualities were required to run it at the level he was aiming for. The management of runners was the daily work of the banking operation. He had 3 or 4 men working routes under him, each responsible for a defined territory, each bringing collections to him at agreed times and in agreed form. He knew what each route should produce on an average day. If a runner came in consistently short without explanation, that was information requiring investigation. If a runner came in with a particularly large collection, that was also information. The territory was producing well and perhaps warranted expansion or a higher commission to retain the man working it. He kept the books himself, not because he did not trust anyone else with them, but because the books were the operation, and the operation was his, and he wanted his hands on the information at all times. The ledger was a plain composition notebook, the entries made in a small, neat hand, columns for intake by route, columns for payouts, a running balance that told him at any moment exactly where he stood. He reviewed it every evening without exception, the way a captain checks the instruments before retiring for the night. The risk management was constant and sophisticated. He diversified the number combinations his operation was exposed to by spreading the action across enough players that no single number hitting represented a catastrophic loss. He maintained relationships with other bankers in adjacent territories so that extremely large bets could be laid off, shared with another operation in exchange for a portion of the action, reducing his exposure on any single outcome. This was reinsurance in everything but name, practiced by men who had never studied finance, but who had arrived at its principles through the pressure of necessity. His standing-ins, the neighborhood was complex. He was respected because he was known to be reliable, to pay what was owed without delay or negotiation, to run a clean operation in the sense that the results were verifiable and the terms were consistent. He was also understood to exist in a particular legal shadow, and the men who worked for him and the customers who played through him all accepted that shadow as part of the arrangement. Oh, nobody pretended otherwise. What he built was small by the standards of the great policy bankers of the era, the men whose operations spanned entire cities and who would eventually attract the attention of organized crime moving in on their territory in the 1940s. But within his scale, he built it soundly, and it produced a stability for his household that showed in the way his children were dressed for school, and the way the rent was always current, and the way he moved through the neighborhood with the particular ease of a man who does not carry financial anxiety with him from room to room. He was not a gangster. He was a businessman operating in the only financial sector that had decided to be fully open to him. He knew that distinction, and he kept it. 3 or 4 men, a borrowed truck, and a reputation for showing up on time and handling things with care. That was enough to build a moving operation in the 1930s that could keep steady work coming through word of mouth alone. Your father ran the crew. He negotiated the price, assigned the work, and made sure everyone got paid fairly at the end of the day. The crew was not a formal company. There were no business cards, no contracts signed in triplicate, no insurance certificates required at the door. There was a handshake with the customer at the beginning and a payment at the end, and in between there was the work, which was everything. The reputation of the operation lived entirely in the quality of what happened between the handshake and the payment, and your father understood this in a way that shaped every decision he made about how the work was done. He chose the men on the crew with care. Strength was necessary, but it was not sufficient. The man who was strong but careless was worse than the man who was careful but needed help on the heavy lifts. A careless man put a wardrobe through a door frame, or dropped a corner of a dresser on a staircase, and the damage cost more than the job was worth. Not just in repair, but in the reputation that took years to build and could be compromised in an afternoon. Your father wanted men who moved with intention, who looked before they committed to a direction, who communicated before they lifted rather than after something went wrong. The morning of a move, he was at the truck first. He had already thought through the job based on what the customer had told him when they arranged it, the size of the furniture, the number of floors, whether there were tight corners on the staircase, whether the new location had a loading situation that would complicate the delivery end. He arrived with a plan, and he communicated the plan to the crew before anyone touched a single piece. Clarity at the beginning prevented confusion in the middle, and confusion in the middle was when things got dropped. The loading sequence was its own discipline. The largest and heaviest pieces went in first against the cab wall, because they were the most stable foundation for everything built on top of them. The fragile pieces came last, cushioned with the quilted pads he kept folded in a wooden crate in the truck bed. The pads smelled like every house he had ever moved, the accumulated scent of 100 families' belongings, a smell that was specific and a little intimate in a way he had never quite put into words. He drove. He always drove, because he knew how the load was distributed in the truck, and he drove with that knowledge in his hands, taking corners more slowly when the weight was forward, avoiding the worst of the road seams that would send vibration through the load. The men rode in the cab with him, and the conversation on those drives was easy. The looseness of men who worked well together and knew it, talking about the neighborhood or nothing in particular, while the city moved past the windows. Payment was settled in cash at the delivery. Once everything was in the new space, and the customer had walked through and confirmed that nothing was damaged and everything was where they wanted it. Your father paid the crew on the spot. Their share counted out and handed over before anyone left the property. He never held wages to the next day or made a man chase what was owed to him. The fairness of the payment was part of what made good men willing to come back the next time he called. By late afternoon, back at the truck in the alley behind the house, he would sit for a moment before going inside. The day was complete. Something had been moved from one place to another through care and skill, and the organized effort of men who trusted each other. A family was in a new home tonight because of work that started this morning. He sat with that for a moment, the particular fullness of a day that had been used well, before the door opened and the evening began. Before landscaping was a branded industry, there were men who kept things growing. Your father knew soil. He knew what to plant and when, how to coax a garden through a dry summer, how to keep a yard looking tended when the man of the house worked 6 days a week and had no time for it himself. The knowledge had come from the land, literally. He or his father before him had grown up somewhere with soil underfoot and seasons that required attention, and that knowledge had traveled north with the family the way recipes travel, not written down, carried in the hands, and the memory and the instinct that woke up again the first time he turned over a patch of city ground and smelled what was underneath. Good soil had a smell. He could tell you whether a garden was going to produce before anything was planted, just from kneeling down and taking a handful and working it between his fingers. His customers were mostly homeowners in neighborhoods where the houses had modest yards, front and back, that were visible to the street and to neighbors, and that therefore carried social meaning. A tended yard said something about the household. An untended yard said something too. And what it said was not always the whole truth about the people who lived there. Sometimes it was just the truth about how many hours were left in a day after the work was done. Your father was the correction for that gap. He arrived in the morning with his own tools, because a man who brings his own tools does not waste the first 30 minutes of a job looking for what he needs in someone else's shed. The spade, the hoe, the hand fork, the pruning shears, the edger, the grass clippers for the places the mower could not reach. The tools qui were maintained with the same attention he gave the soil, the blades clean and sharp, the handles smooth from use, and occasionally rubbed with linseed oil to keep the wood from drying and splitting. The lawn work was the visible part of the job. The mowing, the edging along the walk and the fence line, the raking of clippings into a pile. He did the edging with a care that went slightly beyond what was strictly necessary, because the edge of a lawn was where the quality of the work was most clearly read. A sharp, clean line between the grass and the concrete was the signature of a man who paid attention to detail, and that attention communicated itself to everyone who walked by. The garden work was deeper and more seasonal and required a different kind of knowledge. He knew which vegetables would thrive in the compressed growing conditions of a city yard, and which ones needed more space or more sun than the city could provide. He knew the difference between soil that needed compost and soil that needed lime, and he knew how to get both at the lowest cost, because he had been buying them for years and knew every supplier in the district. He could look at a plant that was struggling and tell you usually what it needed before you had finished describing the symptoms. The relationships with his regular customers ran for years, through the seasons of multiple gardens, through the succession of plantings and harvests that marked the turning of time in a yard under his care. He watched children grow up in houses where he maintained the garden. He saw families arrive and families leave. He knew the yards as intimately as he knew his own. Which plants came back reliably each spring? Which corner caught the afternoon shade that made it suitable for what, where the drainage was poor and needed to be managed? In late October, he would put the gardens to bed, the final cutting back, the mulching of the beds that would carry them through winter, the last conversation with the customer about what they wanted to try differently in the spring. He drove home on those afternoons through streets of bare trees with the smell of turned earth still on his gloves, the year's work finished, the ground resting, and the spring already implicit in everything he had left behind. This one is quieter than the others, less obvious. But in the 1930s, in communities that had survived the unsurvivable, memory was a currency. A man who could sit with a family and help them record who they were, where they came from, which names mattered and why, was providing something that no store sold and no machine could replicate. Your father had always been a listener before he was a speaker. That was the foundation of everything else. He could sit with an elderly woman for 2 hours and receive the whole of what she needed to give, without steering, without rushing, without filling the silences with his own voice before she had found what she was reaching for in hers. The silences were where the most important things lived. He had learned early that a man who could tolerate silence in a conversation was a man that people trusted with the real material. He had begun doing it informally, without any intention of it becoming a source of income. A neighbor had mentioned that her mother, who was very old now and whose memory was beginning to loosen at the edges, had stories about the family's life before the move north. Stories about people whose names would be lost when she was gone, if nobody caught them first. Could your father come and sit with her sometime? He came on a Sunday afternoon and stayed until evening, and came back the following Sunday and the one after that. What he developed over those sessions was a method, though he would not have called it that. He came with nothing that looked like an interview. No list of formal questions, no ledger open on the table. He came with coffee, or accepted whatever was offered, and he settled in and began by asking, about something small and sensory. The smell of the house where she grew up, what the kitchen looked like on a winter morning, the name of the street, and what the street looked like at particular times of day. The small sensory questions unlock the larger memories in a way that direct questions about important events often did not. You could not always ask a person directly about the hardest things, but you could ask them about the smell of the yard in July, and the yard in July would lead you eventually to everything else. He began keeping notes during the sessions, not stenography, but the key names, the dates, the places, the relationships between people, enough to reconstruct the shape of what had been said and to bring it back accurately in the writing that came afterward. The writing was his own work, done at the kitchen table in the evenings, turning his notes into a document that read the way the person talked, not formal, not cleaned up into something that no longer sounded like them, but organized, sequenced, given the structure that an oral telling across multiple afternoons could not always provide for itself. He charged a small fee for the completed document and sometimes no fee at all when the family was in genuine difficulty. The payment was never the point. The point was the document, the thing that would exist after he left, after the old woman was gone, after the children who had heard the story secondhand had grown old themselves. The point was permanence given to what would otherwise be lost. Word moved quietly through the community about what he did. Another family reached out, then another. A man who was dying and wanted his life recorded before it ended. A woman who had a bundle of letters from a grandmother she had never met and wanted help understanding the life behind them. A family whose eldest member remembered things about the journey north, the specific year, the specific train, the town left behind, that would constitute irreplaceable history if anyone thought to capture it. What he was doing, in the language we would use now, was community archiving, the preservation of living memory before it passed out of reach. But he did not call it that, and did not need to. He called it sitting with people. He called it listening. He called it the least he could do for families who had carried more than they should have had to carry, and who deserved to have someone treat that caring as the significant and weighty thing it was. There is a particular kind of service that does not announce itself, that does not appear on any list of professions or hustle guides, that exists only in the willingness of one person to give sustained and genuine attention to another. Your father offered that. In a decade that had taken so much from so many, he sat down across from people and said, in effect, "What you know matters, who you come from matters, and I am here to help you hold on to it." That might have been the most important thing he ever did for money. And it was the one that cost the least to begin. Nothing more than a chair pulled close, a cup of something warm, and the simple radical act of listening until the whole story came. It is Friday morning, and the neighborhood already knows he is coming. The fish hustle in the 1930s. Black community ran on two things, religion and rhythm. Catholic families needed fish on Fridays. Baptist families wanted it fresh for Saturday supper. And a man who could source it early from the docks or the wholesale market, pack it in ice, and move it through the neighborhood before the afternoon heat arrived, was a man with guaranteed customers waiting at the curb before he even turned the corner. He was at the docks or the wholesale fish market before most of the city had finished its first cup of coffee. The market was a specific kind of chaos, organized beneath its surface by relationships and timing that took years to understand. The men who got the best fish at the best prices were not necessarily the men with the most money. They were the men who had been coming longest, who knew which vendor's product was consistently good, who arrived early enough to have first selection before the retail buyers came through and took what was left at higher prices. Your father was one of those men. He had earned his place in the morning order of things through years of showing up before he needed to, before the hustle had grown to the point where the early start was obviously necessary. The fish he bought depended on the season and the price. Catfish and perch were workhorses, affordable, familiar, reliably wanted by the families on his route. Whiting was popular with the Catholic household, who needed something for Friday that was inexpensive enough to serve a large family without strain. When the season was right and the price was favorable, he might bring back something more distinctive, freshwater bass, or a quantity of smelt that he would sell by the pound, and that would disappear from the cart faster than almost anything else he ever carried. The ice was as important as the fish. He packed the catch carefully in layers, fish and ice alternating in the wooden boxes he had built himself to fit the bed of the cart, deep enough to keep the temperature down through the warmest part of the morning. He had learned the hard way, early in the operation, what happened to fish that was not kept cold enough, and how quickly a reputation built on freshness could be damaged by a single batch that arrived at the curb past its best. He did not make that mistake twice. The ice was always sufficient. The fish was always cold. His call on the street was specific to the day and to what he had. He did not use a general announcement. He named what was in the cart, the species, sometimes the size, occasionally the price per pound, if he wanted to create urgency around something that was particularly good value that morning. The specificity was itself a form of advertising. A man who told you exactly what he had was a man with nothing to hide about it. The neighborhood understood this instinctively and responded to it. The women who bought from him brought their own newspaper or their own bags, and he would wrap each purchase with the practiced efficiency of a man who had wrapped several thousand pieces of fish and knew exactly how much paper was needed for 1.5 pounds of catfish. The wrapping was tight and clean. The fish did not leak through before you got it to the kitchen. This was not a small consideration on a Friday morning when a woman was walking back from the curb with her marketing under her arm and her mind already on the noon meal. The Friday fish sale was the peak of the week, but not the only day he worked. Wednesday was a lighter version of Friday. Households that planned ahead or that had a particular preference for midweek fish meals. Saturday he sometimes worked the later morning, selling what remained of the week's buying at a slight discount to move the inventory, rather than absorb the loss of unsold product. He wasted very little because he had learned to buy close to what he could sell, and because his route was well enough established that he understood its capacity with reasonable accuracy. What he provided was access. The fish market was not in the neighborhood. Transportation to and from it cost time and money that many families did not have on a weekday morning. Your father collapsed that distance. He went to the source and brought the source to the street, and the neighborhood ate better and more affordably because he did. That was the invisible public good of the hustle, the thing that did not appear in any accounting of what he earned, but that was real and felt by every family who ate well on a Friday, because he had been up before dawn to make it possible. Not every man in the 1930s neighborhood who moved goods of uncertain origin was dangerous or dishonest by the standards of the community he served. The fence occupied a particular and quietly accepted role in the informal economy. A man who connected things that had become separated from their original owners with people who needed those things and could not afford to acquire them through conventional channels. Your father was careful, selective, and known for discretion, which was the only kind of fence the neighborhood tolerated for long. The goods moved through the back of the house or through an intermediary location, a shed or a rented room, never the front. never in a way that created a visible pattern for anyone paying attention from outside the neighborhood. He did not take everything that was brought to him. That was the first and most important discipline of the operation. A man who took anything regardless of its origin or its risk was a man who would eventually take something that brought serious trouble to his door. Your father had a clear internal accounting of what he would handle and what he would not, and that line did not move regardless of what was offered or what the offered price might be. He understood the economics of what he was doing with a clarity that went beyond simple transaction. The goods he moved had already been removed from wherever they had come from. His involvement did not cause the original act. What he provided was a mechanism for those goods to find a use rather than simply disappearing into a void or being discarded by whoever had taken them. He knew this reasoning had its limits, and he did not use it to justify taking on things that crossed his line. But within his line, he operated without the moral torment that a man with less clarity about his own standards might have carried. The customers who came to him were not criminals in the sense that word conjures. They were neighbors who needed a coat for a child going into winter, a tool for a job they had picked up, a piece of household equipment that had broken and that they could not afford to replace at retail price. They came because they trusted that what your father had was sound, that he would tell them honestly what something was and what it was not, and that the price would be fair relative to the nature of the goods. He never misrepresented what he was selling. If there was a defect, he said so. If the provenance was uncertain, the price reflected that uncertainty, and both parties understood the terms. The sourcing side required relationships with men who moved in worlds adjacent to the one your father inhabited, men who came through occasionally with things to place, who needed the transaction completed quickly and quietly, and who valued a buyer who did not ask questions that did not need asking. He was not close to these men. He maintained a professional distance that was itself a form of protection. The less he knew about the full story of any particular item, the less he had to carry in the event that a conversation with anyone official ever became necessary. His read of risk was constant and finely calibrated. The neighborhood had an immune system when it came to operations that attracted the wrong attention, and your father understood that immune system because he was part of it. An operation that was too visible, too busy, too indiscreet would be felt as a liability by the community it operated in, and a community that felt that way had ways of communicating it. He kept his operation at a scale and a temperature that the neighborhood found acceptable, which meant modest, quiet, and run by a man whose broader character was known and trusted. He was a Sunday church-goer. He helped with the church's annual fundraiser. He knew the names of the children on his block and asked after them by name. These were not performances calculated to provide cover. They were the actual texture of his life, which contained the fencing operation the way a life contains its contradictions, not compartmentalized entirely, but held alongside everything else and weighed against it. He was not only one thing. No person is only one thing. What he ran was small, and it stayed small. And when the conditions changed, when a particular pressure came, or when a relationship that had fed the operation ran dry, he let it contract or stop without grief. It had served its purpose in the years when it was needed. It had put things on the table and shoes on feet, and it had done so with a minimum of harm to anyone that he could see and account for. He held that assessment honestly, without glamorizing it, without condemning it, the way a man holds the complicated record of what he did to keep his family standing in a decade that was trying, in ways both large and specific, to knock them down. And so here we are, son. We have walked through 30 ways a black father in the 1930s got up before the sun and made something out of a day that the wider world had not arranged in his favor. 30 hustles, 30 disciplines, 30 expressions of the same fundamental refusal, the refusal to wait for permission, the refusal to be reduced to what was officially available, the refusal to let the difficulty of the decade become the final word on what was possible for his family. But here is what I want you to sit with before you close your eyes tonight, or before you go back to whatever Tuesday is waiting for you outside this video. None of these men had a business school education. None of them had venture capital. None of them had a mentor in a corner office or a LinkedIn profile, or a podcast telling them to follow their passion and the money would come. What they had was a family that needed to eat tomorrow morning. What they had was a neighborhood that needed things and a pair of hands that could provide them. What they had was the particular intelligence that grows in people who are not given easy options, the intelligence of improvisation, of reading what is available and building from it, rather than waiting for ideal conditions that were never going to arrive. Think about what that actually means. A man with a wooden cart and a block of ice built a route that fed a neighborhood. A man with a grinding wheel on a bicycle frame kept every kitchen knife and every straight razor in a 6-block radius sharp for 20 years. A man with good penmanship sat across from his neighbors and gave their words the power to move landlords and city officials and faraway relatives. A man with a camera and a dark room in a converted closet gave his community the permanent record of itself that it deserved. These were not small things dressed up to sound significant. These were significant things that happened to be small in scale. The scale was a function of the era and the obstacles, not a function of the men themselves. You understand the difference. What I want you to carry out of this video, more than any specific hustle or any particular historical fact, is the image of those men in the early morning, before the neighborhood woke up, before the city started making its noise, in that particular darkness that belongs to the hours before 5, when the only people moving are the people who decided, the night before, that tomorrow was going to be met on their terms. Your father, or his father, or the man 3 generations back, whose name you might not even know, was moving in that darkness. He was loading something, or sharpening something, or writing something down, or pulling on a coat over his work clothes in a kitchen where the coffee was already on because your mother or his mother had put it on before you even asked. He was calculating the day ahead. He was thinking about the route, the customers, the weather, the price of ice this week versus last week, whether the truck would start in the cold, whether the card game on Friday had cleared enough to cover what needed covering. He was not complaining. That is not romanticizing him, erasing the hard parts and keeping only what photographs well. That is simply what the record shows. The men who survived that decade, who kept families fed and housed and clothed and in school through the worst economic collapse the country had ever seen, did it by doing the next thing. Not by resolving the whole problem, not by waiting until conditions improved, by doing the next thing, and then the thing after that, and then the thing after that, until the week was done, and the family had made it through, and Sunday came, and there was a reason to get dressed in the good clothes and walk out the door, like a man who had earned the right to walk anywhere he pleased. That is the inheritance. Not money, though some of them built money too. Not property, though some of them built that as well. The inheritance is the pattern, the way of moving through a world that is not fully open to you, finding the doors that will open and walking through them, building doors where there are none, and doing all of it without making your bitterness the dominant fact of your character. Because bitterness is a weight, and a man carrying unnecessary weight cannot move as fast or as far as he needs to move. You are the continuation of that pattern. Every time you get up early when you did not have to. Every time you build something instead of waiting for something to be built for you. Every time you look at what you have available and ask what it can become, rather than looking at what you do not have and asking why it is not there. You are doing what they did. You are running the same deep hustle in a different decade, with different tools and different obstacles, and the same fundamental question underneath all of it, which is whether you are going to meet the day or let the day meet you. They met the day, son. Every single morning they met it. If this video meant something to you tonight, if it gave you something to think about, or something to feel proud of, or something to carry into tomorrow, please hit the like button and leave me a comment below. Tell me which hustle hit you the hardest. Tell me if your grandfather ran something on the side that nobody ever fully explained to you. Tell me where you are watching from and what time it is there and what the day ahead looks like. Subscribe if you want to keep coming back to this place, this quiet space where we slow down and remember where we came from and why it matters. And go get some rest. Tomorrow is another day that needs to be met, and you are exactly the person to meet it.